We are on Leviticus chapter 19, and kind of as an introduction to this one. Now remember, we're in the midst of Leviticus, literally almost. And as I looked at this chapter, there were several things that were really interesting when you read what people write and whatnot. But one of the things that really stood out to me, when Moses wrote this, he didn't put chapters and verses in there. I think everybody in here knows that. That was added later, so we'd be able to find things and we could know what we were talking about and tell, this is said over here and that type of stuff. Well, we've also gone in and put in titles like, oops, I forgot to change my computer, so it's going to go to sleep on me a lot. Give me just a minute here. That should take care of it. Okay. There's also titles. In some of your Bibles, you're going to see titles in amongst some of the passages. For instance, the ESV starts out with chapter 19 as the title of The Lord is Holy. And you get down to verse 9 and it says, love thy neighbor as yourself. And verse 19 it says, keep my statutes. And so we divide these things up to help us study them. And, these are what people say, okay, these go together, this goes together. I want us to look at these a little bit different this morning. As you read through chapter 19, you're going to see quite frequently the verses being punctuated with, I am Jehovah, or I am the Lord, or I am Yahweh, depending on your version. And sometimes it'll say, I am the Lord your God, and so forth. I want us to look at these passages today, divided that way, because it seems like the things that are mentioned in one section there, before those statements, are tied together. And it helps us understand a little bit about what God is saying, and a little bit sometimes about the way he thinks about things, which is helpful to us. It will help us, I think, to understand the Hebrews a little bit better and how they understood it, and therefore how we understand some of the things in the New Testament. So if we look at verse 1 and 19, this is, excuse me, it starts off saying, okay, God telling Moses, speak to the children of Israel. And the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them. So to me, that's introducing a section. But this is, in essence, if nothing else, telling us that God is saying, Moses, tell the people this. Now, remember, Moses came back and wrote this later. He didn't write it, today God said for me to tell the people this. So there's a little bit of thought in how this was put together, as well as let's not at all forget the inspiration of God. And we get to the phrase that we have read over and over and over in Leviticus. Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. What's it saying? We've heard that a lot. What does that mean?
It means what it says.
Almost. It's funny, when we take passages like this, we see them in a specific way. We say, okay, God's saying, you need to be holy because I'm holy. That's what he's saying, right? That's what we read here. If you jump over, you probably don't have it, but I like to validate things or look at translations a lot. I have 6 translations open so that I can jump between them and see what things say to help figure out what's being translated and whatnot. And one of the translations I like is hard to understand sometimes, because what it does is it tries to translate without changing the order of the sentences around. So sometimes it sounds like Yoda rather than the way we would normally talk in English. But the point is, it's trying to be as literal as possible. And it's called Young's literal translation. And it says it this way: ye are holy, for am I, Jehovah your God. Now think about that for a minute. It sounds like a syllogism almost. You shall be holy, because I'm holy, Jehovah your God. Now, if you were to change the first part of the syllogism and say, okay, I'm not holy, does it change that God is holy? No, God's still holy. Does it change that he's your God? Because you're not putting him in the right place. So it's almost like a different way of thinking of that verse. Not a command to be holy, but this is the way it's set up. This is the way it is. You shall be holy because I'm holy. I'm Jehovah your God. Or because I, Jehovah, am holy. So it's kind of a thought process like that. And that's kind of what we're going to look at. Not necessarily as a syllogism, but as connected arguments so that we can see how what's being thought here. So verse 3. Oh, I need to go back to a version other than Young's literal. Every one of you shall revere his mother and father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God, or I am Jehovah your God. So let's first notice the word revere there. What do some of your other translations say? Fear, reverence. We're going to see this word translated several different ways in chapter 19, but it's all the same concept here. What's the difference between fear and reverence in our minds? It's
Fear is used in the Bible. It's the same thing.
pretty much. It's the word. It's one of the interesting things about some of the writings, some of the other languages, is a word can be used for different meanings, where we tend to put very specific emotional context with words. A good point in that is evil. When we think of the word evil, we think of evil, Whereas in the Old Testament, specifically, in the New Testament to a certain degree, it's more of just bad. Now, I'm not going to say it's not evil as in moral, as in evil, but the word is more like bad. Well, this is the same type of word. It's a reverence. You're going to, okay, you've got a speeding ticket. You go before a judge. Are you going to be sassy to him, or are you going to be respectful? Even if you weren't speeding, you're not going to go up and snap at him and everything else if you expect to be able to get off of that. You're going to respect. You're going to fear the consequences. You're going to, I don't like to use the word revere because we put that as a thing to God, that we only do to God. So we see this type of concept. And I think that helps us understand the concept of fear a little bit, because we often talk about love. Come on, brain. Casteth out all fear. There we go. Thank you. So we see that, we trend to try to want to push that away. But what it's doing is we're not afraid of the consequences because we love God. We love God. That means we're keeping his commandment. This type of concept. But it's all together. So what does it mean when it says you shall revere your mother and father? They have authority over you, right? This is something that everyone was supposed to learn. God said, I've set it up this way. You will revere your father and mother. Now, what does that have to do with keeping the Sabbaths? And this one is very obviously they're connected. What does revering your parents have to do with keeping the Sabbaths? The connection is authority. You see, God says, you're going to do this. God is saying, hey, I've said you're supposed to keep my Sabbaths. You're supposed to rest. You're supposed to do these things. Well, he also said, you're supposed to respect. You're supposed to revere your parents. So you see, my computer is just being stubborn today. So you're supposed to keep these things together. I think the concept here is, hey, here's one and here's another, and they're related somehow. And in this case, I think it has to do with authority. We're going to get into some in a minute, and we'll back up here. But there's a theme going on here that I want you to pick up on. So, verse 4 is another interesting one. Do not turn to idols or make yourselves any god of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. What's the difference between turning to God and making a cast metal god, and what kind of connection would the Hebrews have to this? Is he saying the same thing? Not really. When you think of cast metal, what do you think of with the Hebrews? Golden calf.
Yeah, melted gold.
What's the difference between an idol and what they were attempting to do? God says, I don't want you to have any idols, but I don't want you to make something to claim as me. Remember, they said, this is Jehovah, the God that brought us out of Egypt. See the difference? Having an idol and making something that you're calling God are not necessarily the same, but they're very closely related. But to the Hebrews, that would, you could just see them saying, okay, he's reminding us of what we've done. And so, and that kind of, we can understand that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, also in the land of Egypt and in the surrounding areas, there were multiple gods that people would worship simultaneously. And he's saying, no.
Yeah.
You're worshiping me or you're wrong.
Very good. That's he's putting attention where it needs to be. And we're gonna, like I said, there's a theme coming in here. We're gonna hit in just a minute. Okay, verse 5, and I'm trying to go fast because there's a lot in this chapter. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offering, why did they offer a peace offering, by the way? Let's just back up to our earlier studies. It was a sacrifice of thanksgiving, a sacrifice of commitments, a way of recommitting yourself to God. That, they would often do a peace offering when they completed a vow to God. So, it was not something that was, I hate to use the word commanded, but it wasn't a required sacrifice. This was a sacrifice that was voluntary. This was a sacrifice that they were supposed to say, I want to do this because, not necessarily, I want to do this because God commanded it. So that's the type of thing. And I want to remind us that the word that is translated here for us, peace offering, is shalom. And you've heard people talk about shalom. What that means is kind of a wholeness. It's peace because everything is put together the way God said to. Being right with God. That's the kind of peace that is being talked about here. So that's what this sacrifice is for. It says, okay, when you offer a peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day. Now, we've studied all this. We're going to go through the first part of this quickly. Shall be eaten the same day you offer it, or the day after, and anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted. It will not be accepted, and everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. So Darrell might offer a peace offering, and when he did so, some of that would go to the priest, who also had to eat their part within 2 days. Other parts of it were offered on the sacrifice to God, the fat thereof, kidneys, the whole list. And then the rest of it went back to the person making the offering, who normally would have a feast with it. who would have their friends, or if this was some kind of special occasion, people that were associated with the occasion would come and eat. And there was 2 or 3 requirements in here. One of them was you were not allowed to eat the peace offering if you were unclean, in an unclean state. We talked a lot about that. Or you were not allowed to eat it after a certain time period. And both of those were severely punished. Here, my question is, what does it say happens if you do that? If you eat it after the time period, what does it say you have accomplished? What have you done?
Profane the holy thing of the Lord.
You profaned the holy thing of the Lord. What does profane mean? Corrupt, pollute, that type of a concept. Profane also carries the implication to us as, best way of putting it is to put it in a bad light. You take it from putting it up here and you're putting it down here. You're casting you're disparaging on it. You're messing it up. It's no longer pure. It's no longer good. You have messed it up. So here it says, if you eat it after you're supposed to, you have profaned the thing of God. Now, with that concept in mind for a minute, back up to the other two. When we started out with, you shall be as holy as I am holy. You shall revere your parents. You shall keep the Sabbaths. What happens if you don't do that? You have done the same thing to those. You have profaned them. If you turn to idols, what have you profaned? Think of the world looking at us. If we, for lack of a better example here, turn to idols, there's lots of examples. If we do things the way God hasn't said, what does that do to their minds to God? How many times have you heard somebody say, I'm not going to go to church, there's too many hypocrites in there? That's the concept there. My dad used to say, if you do this, you make your family look bad. You know, that's the concept here, is when we do these things to God, when they did these things to God, we're, to use today's vernacular, dissing God. We're messing it up big time. But that's not the end of this section. It says you're cut off from your people. Now, verse 9, notice that verse 8 didn't stop with I am the Lord your God. I am Jehovah. It doesn't end there. It goes on to 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, ye shall not reap the field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. Ye shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of the vineyard. Ye shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord. What does that have to do with eating within 2 days after the peace offering? They are both profaning what is holy to God. You see, how many times in the Bible does God talk about taking care of those who can't take care of themselves? You know, trying to find just one verse would be hard. One of God's big things, if you want to say it that way, is you take care of those that can't take care of yourself. And you know, isn't that what God has done throughout creation? He's taken care of the things that we can't.
Like you said, the peace offering it's a free will offering, and so you're kind of, there's a feast afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
You have surplus of what you have, and so you're doing pretty well for yourself at that point. And so, it's somewhat also a celebration of that.
Yeah.
It's that relationship with God, and you share with other people, but then it's also...
It's not just those.
Right, but then next is you need to take care of those who are less fortunate also, and leave some out for other people to glean from your fields, and that.
So you're starting to see how these are connected sometimes like this in the script. That's why I wanted to put them to you this way, is because it makes you think about them to figure out, okay, how are these connected? And then by the same token, do those connections apply to us today? It may not be that we have to keep the Sabbath, but don't we have to keep God's commandments? Don't we have to, in other words, the principles will still apply a lot of times. Verse 11, this is interesting. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another. What's the difference between those three things?
Dealing falsely is stealing by way of fraud, whereas stealing doesn't imply you necessarily had contact with the person you stole.
They're both taking something that's not yours, right? What about lying? How does that tie together? You're still defrauding. Why does somebody lie? Because it does something for them. And we're going to see this as we go on here, that doing something for your benefit that is taking from someone else is not right. Whether it be stealing, defrauding, or lying. And then what's the thing that goes after that? How does it connect? Ye shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of God. How does that tie to, hey, you're not supposed to steal or defraud or lie? Well, I think part of it.
This goes back to what you were saying earlier. God said, be holy for I'm holy. So if you're doing all these things, you basically profaning what you had mentioned.
He's showing us how we can be holy. This is what we're supposed to look like. And, you don't. If you're holy, you're not going to be defrauding. You're not going to be stealing. You're not going to be lying. And just as bad as those three is you're not supposed to swear in my name falsely. Now, technically, I don't think we're supposed to swear in his name at all, but specifically falsely. So, it's, when you think of God's, we often think that murder's really bad, but, I'm not going to pay this even though I'm supposed to, is not as bad. God says, hey, it's all bad. You're all not being holy. Yes, sir.
So what's the relationship between saying, okay, this is what you should do, as opposed to just say, imitate my action, imitate the things that I'm doing. I'm trying to teach you by example.
God has done that. God has said, let me show you by example. I'm holy. Be like me. Oh, by the way, yeah, you tend to do all these things, and those aren't what makes you holy. He's helping us understand how to be like him. To continue the thought, but separately, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. What's the difference between oppressing your neighbor and robbing him?
Oppressing him would be keeping him from doing good.
Well, we think in our minds of robbing, we're going to go take something from him. If we oppress somebody, if we treat them badly, if we keep them from, let's say, plowing their field, if we accuse them of things they haven't done, we're doing the same thing. It's just a different outlet. It's just one of them we tend to, you're not supposed to rob. We don't think so much about oppression. What is it? Okay, it's as good as robbing. But it goes on. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. Now, let's put this in their time frame. And even if we move from in the wilderness into when they were in the land, this was not a culture like we're used to today, where we have banks, where we have money laid aside. This was a culture where you went out and worked and you took your money and you went and bought food for your family for that day. So if you hired somebody to do something, the concept is here is, I'm going to keep it till tomorrow because I can do a little bit more with it. I don't have to pay him yet. But you're harming him. You're oppressing, you're robbing him by simply not doing what you're supposed to do and paying them. And it goes on. Ye shall not curse the deaf. Wait a minute. What's the correlation between cursing and deaf?
When you're deaf, you can't hear people.
They literally can't defend themselves. They don't know what you've said. And the next one after it is you're not supposed to put a stumbling block in front of the blind. God is equating those with robbing your neighbor. Think how God is showing them and us how we relate to the world. Because some of these things, we may not literally throw a stumbling block in front of the blind to make them fall, but some of the things we do have the same effect sometimes. Oh, wait a minute. What about my neighbor? What am I doing that they don't see God? They're blind to God. What am I doing that might be throwing a stumbling block in their way? You see, these things do relate to us. But the result or the contrast here from not oppressing your neighbor, not robbing your neighbor, not keeping money till the morning, not cursing to death, not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, not doing those means, oh, you're fearing the Lord.
I think the section is specifically talking about vulnerable people and people that you have power over and how you exercise that authority of those people. Power over. So, yeah, just like the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites while they had power over them, the Israelites aren't supposed to oppress other people when they happen to have power over them.
And that's exactly where this chapter ends, actually. But yes.
Blind and the deaf are a very direct example of that. Is you don't do these things to these people who can't defend themselves or protect themselves in some way.
So once again, we're seeing, okay, how we treat people, how we do these things, how we act. Oh, yeah, we're supposed to be being holy. And if we're not, we're profaning, we're putting God in a bad light. We're hindering the blind spiritually. So, it's interesting the way this goes. Continuing, verse 15. Verse 15. Ye shall do it no injustice in court. Now, different versions say this slightly different. You shall not do injustice in judgment. You should not pervert judgment, this type of thing. But the concept here is the concept of legally. You shall not do injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. Now, we all understand that we're not supposed to take somebody that is rich and famous and treat them with special kid gloves and that they are responsible for their actions. We understand that in the court of law. But how often do we think, oh, they're poor, we need to be special to them. We need to help them, be more lenient to them. They're disadvantaged. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying, don't do that. He's saying, your judgment shall be righteous. He's saying, don't be partial to the poor. Don't respect the poor because they're poor. He's talking about judgment here. And it goes on. This is the good part about these. But in righteousness ye shall judge your neighbor. Now, the word neighbor has got a lot of interesting concepts and talks about it. And it appears that the Jews in the time of Jesus had put a special meaning on the term neighbor that they didn't necessarily work with. The Hebrew word here is used and translated as kinsman or countryman, fellow, associate, relation, sometimes even just as a companion. not necessarily anything to do with what we consider a neighbor. And when Jesus said, when the lawyer asked, well, who is my neighbor? Where our thoughts always go. He didn't use some of their fellow countrymen even. He used a different country. And so neighbor is an interesting word. And when the passage goes on, it says, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around slandering among your people. Your people is more of a specific word that talks about their countrymen, the Israelites, the children of Israel, okay? But what's the connection between you shouldn't go around slandering your neighbor and judgment in court?
Connected to what? What do you?
Right above it, it talks about you shall do righteous judgment in court, that type of thing is what he's talking about. And then this verse, he says, hey, you're not supposed to slander your neighbor. You see, the connection is that if we're slandering our neighbor, whether it be our physical neighbor or one of our neighbors that live in Melbourne or one of our visitors that is sojourning from Japan, doesn't matter, okay? If we're slandering them, we're already judging them. We're committing that judgment. We're saying, hey, did you hear so-and-so did this, this? We're condemning them for doing that. If we're slandering our neighbor, if we say, oh, yeah, they did this, they do this, they did that. We're doing that, whether it's true or false, we're still acting as a judge. And the point above is, hey, you're not supposed to do any unrighteous judgment. And it keeps going. You shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. Now that phrase has had a little bit, there's a little bit of translation issues in here that I'm not sure so much as translation as culture. But the word life here is also the word that is used for blood. In some translations, you shall say you shall not stand up against the blood of your neighbor. The question here is, what does it mean by stand up against? Let me let you think of it this way. If I were to slander my neighbor, I'm putting him down. If I give unrighteous judgment, I am literally standing upon the life of my neighbor. Was it neighbor there? My brain just went dead. Yeah, the life of your neighbor. Once again, that's fellow country, it has a lot. But here, I'm standing on top of. I am profiting. I'm getting, I'm putting them down and I'm raising myself up. That's the concept here. I am the Lord your God. Verse 17. Ye shall not hate your brother in your heart. I read this and I said, okay, did it really say in your heart? So I went back and tried to do my best to do textual lookup on it. I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any stretch. And from what I can tell, yeah, that's what it's saying. So are we supposed to hate our brother at all? No. Are we supposed to hate him in our heart? What is the difference? And what is hate? What does this verse say hate is? But the opposite of hating your brother in your heart. But ye shall reason frankly with your neighbor. What does some other versions use for reason frankly?
You may surely reprove your neighbor.
Reprove. Some versions say rebuke.
Yeah, mine does.
So how does hating your brother and not rebuke him come together?
Bitterness. If you have a conflict and you don't address it.
What happens, and we're going to get into this a little bit more here, what happens if your brother's doing something they're not supposed to do? and you don't tell him?
He keeps doing it.
You say
Doing it. What have you done to him? You have not, well, you have helped him to eternal damnation, is what it boils down to. And we're going to, if you remember back in chapter 18, was it verse 5? No, that's the wrong reference. Hold on a minute. Let me see if I can get to this. No, that's not the reference I was thinking about. Sorry about that. The last half of that verse, lest you incur sin because of him. Two things here. This can be translated or interpreted, maybe I should say, two different ways. One, he's sinning and you don't rebuke him, therefore you're participating in his sin, his sin. Two, hey, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing by helping him. I'm sinning. You see, we key on this word hate. Love is the principle. Hate is when we don't love. Think about that. Hate is when we don't love. What's important?
I'm just going to say James 5:20, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death.
If y'all didn't hear that, James 5, whosoever brings, what? 5:20. Whosoever brings his brother, say it again.
Whoever brings a wanderer back will save his soul from death.
Zach has been teaching a class on evangelism, and the early part of that class was we're supposed to care. What are we supposed to care about? Their souls. It's what God is telling the Hebrews. Hey, oh, and by the way, you remember back in chapter 18 when it was talking about Moloch and offering the children to Moloch, he says, oh, and if you don't, no, maybe it was verse 20, because it was saying if you don't put them to death, chapter 20, I mean, if you don't put him to death, I'm going to cast you out too because you're polluting the land. The concept here is if our actions, if we don't talk frankly, if we don't help lead, correct, whatever, our neighbors, think of friends, families, next door neighbor, whatever, we're not loving them. That's the concept here. You shall not take vengeance. Okay, vengeance is one of those fun things. God says, vengeance is mine. We're not to worry about vengeance. Let's just get that in our head here. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Jehovah. That's his punctuation mark here. So, he's sitting here saying, okay, you are supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, sons of your own people. That's another way of saying the children of Israel. You're not supposed to hold a grudge. He did this to me. Okay, I'll do my duty. I'll go tell him he did wrong. He offers the proper sacrifices. He makes me whole. Whatever he's supposed to do, he's done. But I'm still not happy with him because he did that to me. That's a human nature thing. We tend to do that. And God says, no, that's not being holy. And if you think about God and think about all the things we've done against him, and it says he will remember them no more. I have a note here. Nope, not here. Yeah. I have a note that I've lost, so I guess we'll go on. Okay, so verse 19. This is we're not going to get through this section, I'm pretty sure, but this starts out with, you shall keep my statutes. Now, a lot of people take this as a title to this section. We talked about that beginning. This is a statement. Go back to the statement that was made at the very beginning. You shall be holy. I am holy. I'm your God. God said, ye shall keep my statutes. Period. Part of this is, and if you go down to look at the very end of the chapter, let's jump down there real fast because I want to make sure that we get this. We'll come back to it next week. In verse 36, ye shall have a just balance, just weights, just ephah, just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is interesting here in the fact that it says, hey, I'm Jehovah. I'm your God. I brought you out of Egypt. And that is making a point that is being started up here where we are. And that is, hey, I'm going to set things right. Oh, and go back to the vengeance. God says, I'm just. I am going to set things right. It's going to be right. We're going to do it. And the point here is, you will keep my statutes. I guess there's an implied or else because I am Jehovah. I'm going to set things right. And if you don't keep my statutes, guess what? That's where the fear comes back in. So let's go back to where we were. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made with two kinds of material. Now, we've talked about this. In fact, all of these commandments in here are actually stated elsewhere and sometimes even explained better. But they're summarizing in here, and that's one of the reasons why I think that some of these here are trying to help us understand the importance of some of these things. Now, when we've talked about cattle, not inbreeding cattle with other animals, what were we talking about? What was God's point in these things of not inbreeding your cattle, not sowing your field with different seeds, and not having two different kinds of materials in your garments? What was God telling them with these? What was he talking about? Okay, he was talking about purity. Purity. He was saying, hey, I'm pure. You need to be pure. You're not even going to do these things. You're not. The garment was one that was really, when they were making the priestly garments, that was a big deal as part of that. And so he's taking all these things and putting them together. And this doesn't make as much sense if you don't have that very first verse there saying, ye shall keep my statutes. And then you put these after it. Now, it's time for me to stop. So we're going to stop here. But what I want you to do for next week, read the rest of the chapter. Go back and read the whole chapter again and think about two or three things. One, think about these things together because the hardest one to put together is this one. Because this, verses 20 through 22, almost make no sense unless you can find a context for them. And then verse 23 through 25 helps us add that context. So think about, okay, how do these things fit together? What's God telling us with these three things here? And with all of these, I want all of these little sections in here, go back and think, okay, how does this pollute? How does this profane something that it shouldn't? Some of them it says specifically. Other things we can look at it and say, oh yeah, that's what it's happening here. Thank you for your comments and your attention.